What is that?
Well, it's a poetic description. The Hebrew scholars will tell us it's a poetic description of a physical reality. And we wouldn't have known about this 100 years ago because we didn't understand the deep ocean floor. It's an interesting story about what happened in the history of geological thought. And in the 1850s, a guy called Antonio Snider Pellegrini, he actually was one of the first that looked at the jigsaw puzzle fit of North and South America with Europe and Africa. And he put it back together and said, well, what happened if the fountains of the Great Deep were molten material coming up in big volcanic eruptions that broke up the pre-flood supercontinent and pushed it apart?
So he was looking at this from Genesis paradigm.
Absolutely. He was thinking, the Bible describing all the waters to gather together in one place at the time of creation, so the land was in one place, and the fountains of the Great Deep represented a pre-flood pseudocontinent that was split apart by volcanism, by volcanic activity coming up through rifts and splitting it apart. And he was thinking of continental sprint, the pre-flood supercontinent breaking apart and the fragments sprinting across the surface of the Earth to open up the Atlantic Ocean and produce the configuration of continents that we had today. Now, his ideas weren't taken on board immediately. Even the idea of continental drift, slow and gradual, wasn't proposed in the conventional scientific community until the early 1900s. And for over 50 years, those who proposed the idea of continental drift, and they were thinking in terms of slow and gradual over millions of years because that was their paradigm of thinking, they were opposed and they were ostracized. And this is a good illustration of what can happen with a paradigm change. After the Second World War, governments released maps of the ocean floor that they had developed as part of their submarine warfare. And suddenly, the geologists discovered that there were these mountain chains in the middle of the ocean basins. And they started to explore it. And within 10 years, there was a total paradigm shift. Before, you were scorned if you believed in continental drift. Now it's the reigning paradigm. It's called plate tectonics. The reason it's called plate tectonics is because it's not just the continents that fractured, it was also the ocean floor. And today we have a mosaic of plates that make up the outer skin of the Earth, the crust. Some of those, like the Pacific Ocean floor, is one plate, and it's pushing against the North American plate. And where it slides past one another, it's along the San Andreas Fault in California, which produces earthquakes. Where it's colliding today with the South American continent, the ocean floor is being pushed down underneath, and of course it starts to melt, and so you get the volcanic eruptions in the Andes. You can actually trace the plate's boundaries with the earthquakes and the volcanoes. We talk about the Pacific Ring of Fire. And so the reason why this idea took off of plate tectonics was because it was a very powerful way of explaining the features that we have on the Earth's surface today, where you have volcanoes, where you have earthquakes, those sorts of issues.
And why you have that ridge at the bottom of the ocean.
Correct. Now, there's some things that the conventional plate tectonics model can't explain. And this takes us back to the flood. Because as soon as you start to add in what Pellegrini was talking about, looking at the biblical view of Earth history, suddenly the model becomes more powerful and explaining more information. Now, let me step you through it. So we're saying that at the beginning of the flood, we're going to break open the ocean floor, the fountains of the Great Deep. So it's like the seam of a baseball. You know how you've got all the stitching on a baseball or cracks? We're going to have 70,000 miles of volcanoes suddenly exploding and molten material coming up that's going to raise the ocean floor. You're going to have the steam jets come out because of the release of fluids from inside the Earth. Those steam jets are going to take some of the ocean water and take it up into the atmosphere where it's going to drop. And the Bible talks about the windows of heaven opening, and it was torrential rainfall for 40 days and 40 nights. So the picture, it does explain that imagery that's described in the Bible. But it does more than that, because one of the things that the conventional model doesn't come to grips with is that the fossils, many of the fossils are marine creatures, and they're found buried up on the continents. And so you've got to have a mechanism from taking creatures from the ocean floor and burying them up on the continents in rock